All right, now we begin part 2 of chapter 10's lecture. How are people motivated? Most of the general theories of motivation emphasize 4 essential qualities of motivational states. The first is energizing or stimulate. They activate behaviors. The second is directive. They guide behaviors towards satisfying specific goals or specific needs. And third, helping animals persist in their behavior until they achieve their goals or satisfy their needs. And 4, differing in strength depending on internal and external forces. Motivation is a process that energizes, guides, and maintains behavior toward a goal. Drives motivate the satisfaction of needs. Needs lead to goal-directed behaviors. Failure to satisfy a particular need leads to psychosocial or physical impairment. A need is a state of biological or social deficiency. Maslow's need hierarchy. Maslow is another psychologist. He believed that people are driven by many needs, which he arranged into a need hierarchy. The need hierarchy is Maslow's arrangements of these needs, in which basic survival needs must be met before people can satisfy higher needs. Self-actualization, this is a term that he created. It represents a state that is achieved when one's personal dreams and aspirations have been attained. Maslow's hierarchy is more useful as an indicator of what might be true about people's behaviors than of what actually is true about them. Here's a diagram of his needs hierarchy. You can see at the bottom. So actually on the left, those are the different categories. At the bottom is physiological, hunger, thirst, warmth, air, and sleep. Those would be the most basic needs. Once those are satisfied, you can move up to safety. That represents security, protection, freedom from threats. If those needs are taken care of, then you can move on to belonging and love, which is acceptance and friendship. And beyond that is the level of esteem, represents good self-opinion, accomplishments, and reputation. And then the most important one is self-actualization, living to full potential, achieving personal dreams and aspirations. Drive reduction and homeostasis. A drive is a psychological state that, by creating arousal, motivates an organism to satisfy a need. For biological states such as thirst or hunger, basic drives help animals maintain steadiness or equilibrium. The term homeostasis is the tendency for bodily functions to maintain that equilibrium. According to drive reduction, a need is a deficiency in some area that creates a drive, an internal psychological state. The drive motivates a person to behave in ways that satisfy a need. For example, if you hold your breath, you will start to feel a strong sense of urgency or even anxiety. This state of arousal is a drive. That drive will force you to breathe, satisfying your need for oxygen. Same goes for food and water and oxygen. A psychologist named Hull proposed that when an animal is deprived of some need, such as water, sleep, or sex, a drive increases in proportion to the amount of biological deprivation. Any behavior that satisfies a need is reinforced and therefore is more likely to reoccur. If a behavior consistently reduces a drive, it becomes a habit. Arousal and drive. The Yerkes-Dodson law. The psychological principle that performance on challenging tasks increases with arousal up to a moderate level, and after that, additional arousal impairs the performance. For example, as this law predicts, students perform best on exams when feeling moderate anxiety. Too little anxiety can make them inattentive or unmotivated, while too much anxiety can interfere with their thinking ability. Motivation does not always lower tension and arousal. People are motivated to seek an optimal level of arousal, the level of arousal they most prefer. Here's a graph of the Yerkes-Dodson law. According to this law, performance on challenging tasks increases with arousal up to a moderate level, where it is optimal, and after that point, additional arousal interferes with performance. Each of us has a different level of optimal arousal and motivates us to behave in certain ways. Some people have a lower level of optimal arousal, and these people tend to prefer calmer activities such as reading, which keep arousal at an optimal lower level. Other people have much higher level of optimal arousal. They tend to prefer exciting activities such as skydiving, which raises arousal to an optimal higher level. Personally, I prefer the beach. No jumping out of planes for me. People are motivated by incentives. Drive states that push us to reduce arousal, but we are also pulled towards certain things in our environment. Incentives. These are external objects or external goals rather than internal ones that motivate behaviors. Even forces outside our conscious awareness can provide incentives to behave in particular ways, such as subliminal messages or advertising. Extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. Pleasure can be associated with the satisfaction of biological needs and the performance of adaptive behaviors. Extrinsic motivation is motivation to perform an activity because of the external goals towards which that activity is directed. For example, working to receive a paycheck. Intrinsic motivation is motivation to perform an activity because of the value or pleasure associated with that activity, rather than for the apparent external goal or purpose, reading a good book, novel, or listening to music. Extrinsic motivation is an external factor that causes people to behave in a certain way. That factor is a reward. A major example is money. Intrinsic motivation causes people to behave in a certain way simply because of the activity itself, or the result of the activity, as enjoyable. Rewards can undermine intrinsic motives. Consistent evidence suggests that extrinsic rewards can undermine intrinsic motivation. Self-determination theory. People are motivated to satisfy needs for competence, relatedness to others, and autonomy, which is a sense of personal control. Extrinsic rewards may reduce intrinsic value because such rewards undermines people's feeling that they are choosing to do something for themselves. In contrast, feelings of autonomy and competence may make people feel good about themselves and inspire them to do their most creative work. Self-perception theory. People are seldom aware of their specific motives. They draw inferences about their motives according to what seems to make the most sense. Rewarding people for engaging in an intrinsic activity gives them an alternate explanation for engaging in it. The reward replaces the goal of pure pleasure. The pleasure versus pain and approach avoidance motivation. Sigmund Freud proposed that drives are satisfied according to the pleasure principle, which encourages people to seek pleasure and avoid pain. The concept of hedonism refers to the human's desire for pleasantness. From an evolutionary perspective, positive and negative incentives are adaptive. Approach motivations. We seek out food, sex, and companionship because they are typically associated with pleasure. Avoidance motivation. We avoid negative outcomes such as dangerous animals because of the association with pain. Animals prefer to eat sweets. Sweetness usually indicates that food is safe to eat. By contrast, most poisons and toxins taste bitter, so it is not surprising that animals avoid bitter tastes. People set goals to achieve. A psychologist named Murray proposed 27 basic psychosocial needs, including the needs for power, autonomy, achievement, and play. A key insight in the study of psychosocial needs is that people are especially motivated to achieve personal goals. Self-regulation of behavior is the process by which people change their behavior to attain personal goals. According to a theory developed by Locke and Latham, challenging the specific goals are best as long as they are not overly difficult. Challenging goals encourage effort, persistence, and concentration. Goals that are too easy or too hard can undermine motivation and therefore lead to failure. Dividing specific goals into concrete steps and focusing on short-term goals facilitates achieving long-term goals. Self-efficacy and the achievement motive. Another psychologist named Bandura argued that people's personal expectations for success play an important role in motivation. Self-efficacy is the expectation that your efforts will lead to success. For example, not believing your efforts will pay off may discourage you from trying. The achievement motive is the desire to do well relative to standards of excellence. Individuals high in achievement motivation set challenging but attainable personal goals, while those low in achievement motivation set extremely easy or impossibly high goals. Delayed gratification. One common challenge in self-regulation is postponing immediate gratification in the pursuit of long-term goals. The ability to delay gratification is predictive of success in life. More socially competent and better able to handle frustration. The ability to delay gratification in children has been found to predict higher SAT scores and better school grades. A 40-year follow-up study found the ability to delay gratification remained stable into adulthood. According to Michel and Metcalf, the most successful strategy to delay gratification involves turning hot cognitions into cold cognitions, mentally transforming the desired object into something undesired. Hot cognitions focus on the rewarding, pleasurable aspects of objects. Cold cognitions focus on conceptual or symbolic meanings. Metcalf and Michel proposed that this hot-cold distinction is based on how the brain processes the information. The amygdala and the nucleus accumbens are important for motivating behavior. The prefrontal cortex performs cold cognitive processes, such as the control of thought and behavior, and helps us make choices that may optimize survival. These three techniques help a person delay gratification. Here you can see child is sitting there thinking about clouds instead of tasty marshmallows. She then tries to ignore the marshmallows by self-distraction. Grit is a factor that is related to a person's ability to achieve long-term goals. People with grit have a deep passion for their goals and a willingness to keep working towards them, even in spite of hardships and pitfalls. People also have a need to belong. Over the course of human evolution, our ancestors who lived with others were more likely to survive and pass along their genes. Effective groups shared food, provided mates, and helped care for offspring, including orphans. The need to belong theory is a theory that the need for interpersonal attachments is a fundamental motive that has evolved for adaptive purposes. Making and keeping friends. Societies differ in their types of groups, but all societies have some form of group membership. Not belonging to a group increases a person's risk for various adverse consequences, such as illness and premature death. Such negative effects suggest that the need to belong is a basic motive driving behavior. Evidence indicates that people feel anxious when facing exclusion from their social groups. People who are shy and lonely tend to worry most about social evaluation and pay much more attention to social information. The need to belong is so strong that someone with extreme isolation might bond with an inanimate object. In this image from the movie Castaway, Tom Hanks' character is painting a face on the volleyball and names it Wilson, which he then talks to for much of the movie. I laugh, but we'd probably all do the same thing. Anxiety and affiliation. Schachter found that increased anxiety led to increased affiliative motivations. Other people provide information that helps us evaluate whether we are acting appropriately. According to Festinger's social comparison theory, we are motivated to have accurate information about ourselves and others. We compare ourselves with those around us to test and validate personal beliefs and emotional responses. The effect occurs especially when the situation is ambiguous and we can compare ourselves with people relatively similar to us. What motivates eating? Eating involves much more than simply survival. Around the globe, special occasions often involve elaborate feasts, and much of the social world revolves around eating. Common sense dictates that most eating is strongly influenced by hunger and satiety, but eating behavior, in fact, is determined by complex interactions between biology, cultural influences, and cognition. Many physiological factors influence eating. The hypothalamus integrates the various inhibitory and excitatory feeding messages, and it organizes behaviors involved in eating. Damage to the hypothalamus dramatically changes eating behavior and body weight. A damaged ventromedial middle region, the VMH, is the area of the brain. When this is damaged in rats, they eat far more than normal. This is called hyperphagia and leads to obesity. Damage to a different region of the brain called the lateral outer region, LH. In this case, in rats, they eat far less than normal. This is called aphasia, and it leads to weight loss and eventual death unless force-fed. The hypothalamus monitors various hormones and nutrients and operates to maintain a state of homeostasis. A region of the prefrontal cortex processes taste cues such as sweetness and saltiness. Such cues indicate the potential reward value of particular foods. The craving triggered by seeing tasty food is associated with activity in the limbic system. And damage to the limbic system or the right frontal lobe sometimes produces gourmand syndrome, in which people become obsessed with the quality and variety of food and how food is prepared. Internal sensations. Contractions and distensions of the stomach can make the stomach growl. However, research has established that these movements are relatively minor determinants of hunger and eating. People who have had their stomachs removed continue to report being hungry. The glucostatic theory proposes that the bloodstream is monitored for its glucose levels. Because glucose is the primary fuel for metabolism and is especially crucial for neuronal activity, it makes sense for animals to become hungry when they are deficient in glucose. The lipostatic theory proposes a set point for body fat. When an animal loses body fat, hunger signals motivate eating and the return to that set point. Several biological factors combine to influence our motivation to eat, including hormonal signals from fat cells, the stomach, and the pancreas. The hypothalamus regulates hunger and satiety signals. Hormonal activity. 3 hormones that are most important in hunger and eating. Insulin is a hormone regulating glucose levels in the bloodstream. It allows the cells of the body to process the glucose so that the body has energy to function. Leptin is another hormone. It's released from fat cells as more fat is stored and travels to the hypothalamus where it acts to inhibit eating behavior. This other hormone I'm going to try to pronounce, ghrelin. This hormone originating in the stomach surges before meals, then decreases after people eat. It may play an important role in triggering eating. Leptin is associated with long-term body fat regulation, whereas ghrelin motivates eating behavior. Eating is influenced by time and taste. We have been classically conditioned to associate eating with regular meal times. The clock indicating mealtime is much like Pavlov's metronome. Meal times lead to various anticipatory responses that motivate eating behavior and prepare the body for digestion. For example, An increase in insulin promotes glucose use and increases short-term hunger signals. Flavor and variety motivate eating. Animals, including humans, will stop eating relatively quickly if they have just one type of food to eat, but they will continue eating if presented with a different type of food. Sensory-specific satiety. Animals eat more when presented with a variety of foods as they quickly grow tired of any one flavor. The region of the frontal lobes that is involved in assessing the reward value of food exhibits decreased activity when the same food is eaten over and over, but shows increased activity when a new food is presented. Sensory-specific satiety may be advantageous because eating many types of food is more likely to satisfy nutritional requirements. Eating large meals may have been adaptive when the food supply was scarce or unpredictable. When people are presented with a variety of foods, they tend to eat more than if they were presented with only a few foods. Who hasn't sampled a little bit of everything when they visit a large buffet? I know I have. All right, the role of culture. What people will eat is determined by a combination of personal experience and cultural beliefs. It has little to do with logic and everything to do with what we believe is food. Unfamiliar foods may be dangerous or poisonous, so avoiding them is adaptive for survival. Local norms for what to eat and how to prepare it, guidelines that a psychologist named Rosen calls cuisine, reinforce many food preferences. Religion and cultural values often tell people which foods to avoid. Taboos are certain types of food that may have been adaptive in the past because these foods were likely to contain harmful bacteria. Many food taboos and preferences are idiosyncratic and reflect an evolved group preference for specific foods prepared and eaten in certain ways. Crickets are a popular snack among Cambodians. What factors would influence you to eat or refuse a fried cricket being offered in this vendor in Phnom Penh? That would take an awful lot to get me to eat a fried cricket. I've heard they're all right, though. As this graph illustrates, animals, including humans, tend to like the food they know, and they tend to avoid unfamiliar food. Can you think of a food that you first thought strange and unfamiliar but now love? For me, it's sushi. I can't get enough of it. What motivates sexual behavior? Variation in sexual frequency can be explained by individual differences and by society's dominating influence over how and when individuals engage in sexual activity. This section examines what psychological science has learned about the motivation for sex. Hormones. They are involved in producing and terminating sexual behaviors. Hormones influence the development of secondary sex characteristics during puberty and motivate sexual behavior. Males have a greater quantity of androgens than females, and females have more estrogens and progesterone activity. Males need a certain amount of testosterone, a type of androgen, to be able to engage in sex, but they do not perform better if they have more testosterone. The more testosterone women have, the more likely they are to have sexual thoughts and desires, although normal females have relatively low levels of testosterone. Oxytocin is another important hormone, and it is released during sexual arousal and orgasm. Some researchers believe oxytocin may provide feelings of love and attachment between partners. It also seems to be involved in social behavior more generally. Neurotransmitters, including dopamine, serotonin, and nitric oxide, have also been found to influence sexual functioning. Dopamine receptors in the limbic system are involved in the physical experience of pleasure, and dopamine receptors in the hypothalamus stimulate sexual activity. The most common pharmacological treatments for depression enhance serotonin function, but they seriously reduce sexual interest, especially for women. Sexual stimulation leads to nitric oxide production. The increased nitric oxide promotes blood flow to specific areas and subsequently plays an important role in sexual arousal. The menstrual cycle. Women differ from men in how the hypothalamus controls the release of sex hormones. In men, hormones are released at the same rate over time on a circadian cycle. In women, however, the release of hormones varies according to a cycle that repeats itself approximately every 28 days, the menstrual cycle. Research has found only minimal evidence that women's sexual behavior varies across the menstrual cycle. Recent evidence indicates, however, that women may process social information differently depending on whether they are in a fertile phase of the cycle. The sexual response cycle. This is a four-stage pattern of physiological and psychological responses during sexual activity. The excitement phase. This is the first stage of sexual response cycle, when people contemplate sexual activity or begin engaging in sexual behaviors. Second phase is the plateau phase. This is when pulse rate, breathing, and blood pressure increase, as do the various other signs of arousal. The orgasm phase is the third stage, consisting of involuntary muscle contractions throughout the body, dramatic increases in breathing and heart rate, and rhythmic contractions of the vagina for women and ejaculation of semen for men. The fourth phase, the resolution phase, involves dramatic release of sexual attention and a slow return to the normal state of arousal. The male enters a refractory period during which he is temporarily unable to maintain an erection or have an orgasm, and the female does not have such a refractory period. Culture scripts and cultural rules shape sexual interactions. The depiction of sexual behavior in movies and other media shapes beliefs and expectations about what sexual behaviors are appropriate and when they are appropriate. Sexual scripts, these are cognitive beliefs about how a sexual episode should be enacted. The scripts differ in many places in the world, such as countries where arranged marriages are common. Although sexual customs and norms vary across cultures, all known cultures have some form of sexual morality. For example, one well-known pattern of regulating sexual behavior is the double standard. This unwritten law stipulates that certain activities, such as premarital or casual sex, are morally and socially acceptable for men, but not for women. Sex differences in sexual behavior. Erotic plasticity. This is the extent that sex drive can be shaped by social, cultural, and situational factors. Women's sexual desires and behaviors depend significantly on social factors such as education and religion, whereas men's sexuality shows minimal relationships to such influences. Sexual strategies theory. This is a theory that maintains that women and men have evolved distinct mating strategies because they face different adaptive problems over the course of human history. The strategies used by each sex maximize the probability of passing along their genes to future generations. According to this theory, women are more likely to be cautious about having sex because having offspring is a much more intensive commitment for them than it is for men. There is evidence that women are much less willing than men to have sex with someone they do not know well. Mate preferences. Men and women look for similar qualities in potential partners, but men are more concerned about a potential partner's attractiveness, and women are more concerned with the potential partner's status. These differences in relative importance may be due to the different adaptive problems the sexes faced over the course of human evolutionary history. Both men and women value physical attractive highly, but their relative emphasis conforms to evolutionary predictions. Instinctive behaviors are constrained by social context. The frontal lobes work to inhibit people from breaking social rules, which are determined largely by culture. These standards shape the context in which men and women view sexual behavior as desirable and appropriate. People differ in sexual orientations. Through history and across cultures, most people experience attraction to people of the opposite sex. But homosexual behavior has been noted in various forms throughout recorded history. Until 1973, psychiatrists in Western cultures officially viewed homosexuality as a mental illness. Many of these theories of sexual orientation have emerged, but none has received conclusive support. The overwhelming majority of studies have found little to no evidence that how parents treat their children or any other environmental factors have anything to do with sexual orientation. Biological factors. The best available evidence suggests that exposure to hormones, especially androgens, in the prenatal environment might play some role in sexual orientation. Researchers found that altering the expression of a single master gene reversed the sexual orientations of male and female flies. It remains unclear how human sexual orientation might be encoded in the genes. Some research suggests the hypothalamus may be related to sexual orientation. And with that concludes part 2 of the chapter this week on emotion and motivation.